Hello and welcome to this May edition of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. This month we're going to be taking a look at 4321, the new magnum opus by Paul Auster. Paul Auster, if you're not familiar, has been a kind of mainstay of modern American surrealist fiction for a long time. His writing tends to borrow heavily from tropes of classic detective fiction, but also a great deal of postmodernism. He was heralded to me by a friend of mine as being the American Haruki Murakami, at which point I was just completely sold. Uh, that said, this new book, 4321, has been very polarizing in the press, and it will likely be very polarizing in this discussion. Uh, Paul Auster is someone who likes to play with story structure, and in this case, what he does in 4321 is present the life of Archie Ferguson, his protagonist character, whose life unfurls in four different ways. So we have four different versions of the same life, is what this is, and it is the life of a young man growing from birth all the way into adulthood, just told four different ways with four different possible outcomes, and so we'll get into the mechanics of it as we talk. But this is a bit outside, to editorialize on my own end. This is a bit outside of what Paul Auster normally writes. He has two kind of styles, or two kind of stories that he tells. One of them is the sort of film noir meets Franz Kafka concept that we see in his famous New York trilogy, which is my favorite work by him. The New York trilogy, which includes City of Glass, Ghosts, and The Locked Room, and those three novels all combine detective fiction tropes with kind of surrealist existential dread and all of that. And then the other style that he writes is he writes these kind of, I guess you could call them human interest stories, these sort of feel-good stories about they're slice of life kind of stories, and the Brooklyn Follies is a good example of that. Sunset Park is another good example of that. I love the Brooklyn Follies. I was not as crazy about Sunset Park. I thought it fell short. This book, he's trying something altogether different. He's trying something rather new for him. His works are usually very short. This is almost 1,000 pages, and for me, it succeeded in some areas and failed in others. And I will warn you right now, this is going to be a very spoiler-heavy discussion, because I think we need to talk it's one of those stories where we need to just talk openly and honestly about everything that happened in the book to really get across our feelings about it. Sorry. All right, there we go. Anyway, so it's going to be something where we have to just talk about the book in its entirety to really get our feelings out there and understood. That said, Stefan, I will let you kick it off, but I want to borrow a quote, something you said in our private correspondence when I asked you your opinion of the novel. You said you wanted to kill Paul Auster and tell the judge it was done in the name of literature. So go from.
Well, Jordan mentioned that the genre was slice of life. So when you think of that genre, you have to remember that there's not going to be a plot specific to a character. There's not going to be any end goal. So that means there's no narration, or if there is narration, it's going to just be a series of events, which was what a basic story is. What you're primarily going to get is dialogue and the happenstance of people describing things in dialogue, and then the author describing things in the world. So that's slice of life. What Paul Auster does is he takes four novellas of the same character. So he wrote one character, and he wrote a chapter, then he wrote another chapter of the same character, and he went on and on. And in those four novellas, something is slightly different, whether it's the character, an event, another character associated with another character, relationship with that character. So it's kind of like 4 different universes, and he's telling them across 7 chapters. And this is experimental at best, and a gigantic waste of your time at worst. The reason why, the analogy I always give a lot of food analogies just because it's easier for me. If you go to a restaurant and you want a hamburger, and they say, great, we're going to give you this amazing hamburger, look out. So they give you 4 plates, and on the 4 plates are 7 sliders each, except for the second plate, which only has 2 for some reason. And instead of it being a hamburger, it's a veggie burger, but the veggies aren't very tasty. They don't really taste like something you'd want to ever order in your life. So it's like, oh, it's a giant eggplant patty as opposed to beef, or this is a giant slice of cucumber as opposed to a veggie burger, or whatever. So you have like these 7, and you eat them one at a time on each plate, and you go, and you keep doing that and doing that and doing that until you get halfway through, and you're like, geez, I can't remember what I'm eating or what goes where, or it all becomes this amalgamation of something about this guy who was an author, who might have been a journalist, who grew up doing reporting, who ended up becoming a reporter, who may or may not be bisexual. It's this amalgamation of what is going on. And the other half of the time, I'm thinking, what is going through this writer's head? Did he like wake up one day and say, hey, I didn't like what I wrote at that timeline, I'm going to start another timeline here. So there's that aspect. Now, within the timeline, sometimes he'll jump back in time in the same timeline and describe a childhood memory, or he'll go back or go forward again. And it's sort of him just being creative for the sake of it, I think. And this is usually a fault of not knowing when to stop writing and not having a good editor. So if you really wanted to have this kind of story where continuity is broken, you have to have a contextual and a content reason for that. For example, I wrote a short story, and it was a short story. 37 pages is pretty long for a short story, but I wrote it 37 pages. And I had chapter 4, then I did chapter 2, and it was in that order, and I kept jumping it around. But the story was about a guy traveling through time and traveling through space, so that's what he was trying to relate. There's a reason why I did that. There's a reason why I broke things down, for the reader to go, why is things broken? And then you finally realize that he's trying to tell you a story of how he experienced it, and time was wonky and he couldn't quite explain it. That's enough to explain why I fool around with the narrative, why I fool around the margins, why I fool around the chapters. I'm allowed to do that if there's an explanation that makes sense. In this story, there's no continuity between the 4 universes or timelines. It's just creativity for the sake of it, and then you get 4 novellas running concurrently, and then blowing the page count to like 1,000 for like a novel size. And it's not a novel; it's a slice of life. So it's boring. It's redundant. You realize that chapter 1.1 is continued in chapter 2.1, which is like a week later, and then you have to go back and figure out what the heck 1.1 was. Thankfully, in 2.2, I think one of the characters die. And then the author has the gall to put 3.2, 4.2, and then just have a blank page. And it's like, why did you even waste that paper? I mean, it's just this gigantic piece of work, which should have been an experimental short story with multiple timelines, so that we could at least follow it and appreciate what the hell was going on. Because when I got halfway through, I was like, okay, is this the bisexual struggling to be a writer? Is this the guy who lost his fingers trying to be a journalist? Like, which stream am I in? I can't, like, my mind is no longer following it. So it's hard enough to follow one story. It's really bad to try and follow 4 that are ever so slightly different, and then you stop caring, or you can't digest it, really.
Yeah. Well, that was what, for me, I thought that what I liked in this, there were a couple of things I liked. One was that I like the observations he makes about choice. There are some ideas about the choices we make in our life. And that is kind of the underlying theme, is like, we make these minute choices in our lives, and they have these they take us on these wide branching paths. And, I like the idea that, these different courses in our life, that they go off and just based on these tiny little threads. The basic premise here to set up what Stefan's talking about is you have these characters, or you have this character Archie, and basically the first set of chapters, 1.1 through 1.4, basically each one of those sets up a different trajectory in his life, and each of those trajectories is set up by what happens with his father and their department store, and the family department store. The father, and I think this makes sense to me because that he would do it this way, because when you're 4 or 5 years old, what decisions can you really make that are going to influence the outcome of your life? It's all about what kind of setup you get from your parents, from the world around you, that kind of thing. And when I'm and then what happens, the father is this department store owner, and in the first track, the 1.1 track, he is unsuccessful as a department store owner, sells it off, and becomes a handyman, and they have this kind of modest, blue-collar upbringing for Archie and for Ferguson, the character. And then in 2.2, he keeps the department store. It's not quite as successful, and that's the one where Ferguson gets killed off very early anyway, so it doesn't matter. Which makes me wonder why he bothered doing that one anyway. But then the third one, the father dies in a department store fire, and so it's sets up Ferguson for this life without his father. And this one I had kind of a beef with, just because it was written so stereotypically. It's like he's got no father, so he's filled with despair and hopelessness, and goes off into a wild, decadent life of drugs and alcohol and careless sex with men and women, and this downward spirals, requiem for a dream, self-destructive path. And then the 0.4 chapters, these are the chapters where his father is insanely successful as a department store owner. Takes the one department store, turns it into like a chain of big box department stores, and they are millionaires, and he grows up having this very affluent life. He goes off to college and becomes a writer, and becomes a successful writer. And this is why I say we have to do spoiler alert that we're going to talk about the whole thing from the get-go, because in this story, what happens is, or in the fourth tract, we find out why he's been killing off the different characters, the different incarnations of Ferguson, because 0.4 is the real Ferguson, and the other three were versions of himself that Ferguson was writing as an exercise in experimental fiction, which makes me feel like this is a writer on board moment, and this is Paul Auster trying to chart his own development as a writer in some way. And he does use a lot of autobiographical elements in his writing. In City of Glass, he shows up as an actual character, in the book. So so that's what that kind of rang hollow with me when I found out at the very, very, and when I say very end, I'm talking like the last 2 pages. When I found out at the very end that's what all of this was, it's very unsatisfying to me, because now it just seems like now it just feels like it was all a dream, basically is what he's saying. The other three were just made up, and this fourth one's the only real one. One problem, and also that there's also a problem with the writing where at the end of the 1.1 tract, we have that version of Archie who has taken some girl up to his apartment, and the pervert that lives downstairs is sitting there smoking a cigarette and listening to the sound of Archie and this new girl fucking. And that's where it ends. And then he explains to us at the end of the 0.4 tract that as he's writing the other three narratives, that he's going to kill off, that he actually kills off that .1 version of Archie by having that pervert fall asleep and drop his cigarette, and it starts a fire, and that kills that Archie. So he kills off all three of the other versions of himself, and the .2 version dies when a tree hits him on the head. The .3 version dies in a car accident, and then the .1 version. But it's like God, you couldn't even explain that in the .1. You had to save it for like almost some kind of pseudo epilogue, and then in the .3 track, I hated the .3 track the most. One, because it was that like very stereotypical Requiem for a Dream descent into debauchery. But what I didn't like was we've had this whole novel about the concept of choice and the idea of that the choices we make ultimately make us. And then finally, at the end of the .3 track, the bisexual, debauched version of Archie becomes a published novelist and gets rave reviews, and by all accounts, he's going to become a wildly successful author. And then he travels to London for his first promotional tour as an author and gets hit by a car out of random. And it's like, well, wait a minute. This whole thing has been building up to, has been about the choices we make. My lifestyle determines my death style, basically. And this one just gets, the one that has made all of the bad choices just gets killed off for a random, disconnected reason. It's the reason he gets hit by the cars. He's in London, and he looks because cars are on the opposite side of the road. He looks the wrong direction before crossing the street and gets hit by a car, and that really by the middle of the book, I enjoyed, I think, the first 3 or 4 of the chapters, and then by the middle of the book, I was really not liking that character. And when I finally got to his outcome, I was like, no, this is not good. I'm not feeling this. And then the other 2 tracks that survive into adulthood, I got tired of, because it just becomes, by the end of the book, it just becomes this thing about the 60s, about all of the campus riots and all of the stuff that's going. And I'm just like, you know what? We need, as a culture, we need to let go of the 60s, okay? We have been, if you think about it, for the last 40 some odd years, the elder statesmen of literature and culture and all of this have been people who have come out of this flower power generation, who think that they changed the world, and they ushered in some kind of new renaissance. And in a way, they did. The music and the art and the literature that came out of the time was fantastic. But then the older you get, the more you realize the protest is all just a bunch of a lot of it was just a bunch of noise. It's like Shelby Steele, the black conservative author, talks about how what the hippie flower power generation did for the civil rights movement is they took it from being a legitimate cause and turned it into a trendy hipster thing to do. Like, it was a trendy thing to be fighting racism. And we see that now with the modern social justice movement. And so that's what it's like. We need to fucking let go of the 60s. Okay, yes, you were there when Kennedy got shot. Yes, you were there when King got shot. Yes, you were there, when we landed on the moon. Yes, you marched against Vietnam. It's like he's just going down this checklist of all of the great things that a person in the 60s was supposed to have done. And Paul Auster was, I assume, in New York during the 60s, so I'm sure he got to experience a lot of this. And it was just like, oh my God, we've literally forgotten the running theme of the story, that it's about the choices we make and how they affect us. And we're just going into long descriptions of running around during campus riots and, dodging tear gas and all of this shit. And it's like, none of it means anything. It doesn't affect the story. It's just like, September came and these famous events happened. Ferguson was doing blah, 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 blah. And, and I just, oh my God, what what I did like consistently, bringing it back around from my ranting, because it does, this book really does go on about 400 pages too long, is at best. What I did like throughout the story was how there are certain character relationships that develop that are different in every story thread, and I really liked that. I thought that was fascinating. And one of the central ones is the character of Amy Schneiderman, who in the 1.1 track, she becomes the love of his life, and they set up this life together, and then she leaves him, and it crushes him and all of that. And then in the second one, he gets killed off before she really factors into it. Then in the third one, they have this like passing fling, and then in the fourth one, her father and his mother end up getting divorced and then remarried to each other, so they become step siblings. And that relationship was interesting. I thought it was fascinating how, our relationship with the same person can become different things based on circumstance and based on how we approach it and all that. That was great. And if we had just done 4 different versions of the relationship with Amy Schneiderman, I would have thought that was fantastic. But instead, we get lost in a lot of stuff. Now, the other thing I did like, Stefan, you had mentioned there's a story. There's a story that one of the iterations of Ferguson writes about a pair of talking shoes, and are shoes that they don't talk to humans, but they talk to one another, and it's this whole existential thing about their life as humans, or a life as shoes, as servants of humans, and all of that. And that story is summarized in great detail in the book. That story is actually more like the kind of thing Paul Auster usually writes, and that's where it's more surreal, more existentialist, and that sort of thing. It feels like, there's echoes of Sartre and that kind of thing in Kafka and all of that. And then also some of the other, because this fourth version of Ferguson is becoming Paul Auster, obviously, he starts writing more and more stories that we hear about that are like what Paul Auster writes. So it feels for a minute like you're thumbing through a notebook of interesting Paul Auster ideas. That I did like, and in those moments, I felt like I was reading Paul Auster. The rest of the time, it had none of the feel of his stuff, and that's what's weird to me. Is like, I know you hated this one, Stefan, but I'm telling you, like, maybe sometime try reading one of the New York trilogy books. None of the books in that trilogy are more than 100 pages long, and just you'd get a totally different. You would know immediately why I was pushing so hard for this one. But anyway, that's a long rant from me, and that I'm sure the listener is unbelievably confused at this point. Which, dude, we read the whole thing, and so are we. Any more thoughts on your end, Stefan?
Well, the mention about books or stories within the story. There's poetry. You have like about 3 or 4 others. There's like a diary of some sort or something. Chronological order, and it's like, okay, why are we getting into more stories of stories when we really just need to focus on the one? And yeah, definitely cut out, I'd say more than half. I'd say at least 60 to 70% of the stuff just to focus on whatever, because Amy was probably one of the more central figures, along with his mother. They were very specific in their role, and they were always there in the stories, and they were such a big factor in his development. But one thing I didn't quite grasp was the choice. Like, yeah, if it was about choice, and if it was about Ferguson and his choices, that would have been great, as we saw different opportunities in each timeline. But these are individual universes. Like, they are external to his choices. So yeah, that would be great. Like, if we could properly understand his bisexualism or his first experiences, like I didn't, at first I read it, I was like, how did this happen? Because he just broke up with Amy, and he was obsessed with her breasts, and he was so excited about her, and all of a sudden he meets this guy he likes, not sexually, but they share a love of stories and movies, and it's just like imagine that happening to you. Like, how would you wrap your head? Like, I'm not here to comment about sexuality between homosexuals and bisexuals and how that starts, But to me, I was like, this is very strange. This is almost bizarre. And then luckily there was a short little epilogue or after the fact where she got into some detail. But even then it was just like, okay, that was really awkward where he's staring up at the ceiling for 2 hours wondering what he's doing with himself.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, that's at least something, but I still couldn't fathom what was going on there. Now, because it's slice of life, naturally things like money and romance and jobs and sex, that's going to happen. It was just so bizarre to have such a big focus on that, especially with Amy and all the women he's met when he's in Paris and wherever else he was going in certain timelines. So that's a given. But I was like, okay, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What's the big deal? Why are we focusing on all these things and going into so much detail and who's with who and Amy's going to get married or not going to get married? Okay, fine. Who's the main character here anymore? So when it came to the ending and you read that last 10 pages, you're like, oh, okay, thanks. That was like a big slap in the face to everyone.
Yeah.
Saying that, yeah, by the way, the fourth platter that was the real burger I wanted to serve you guys. The other three were just experiments. Well, if that's the case, why did you give us those other three timelines? What was the point? Was it an experimental thing for you to figure out what you wanted to do? Because when you read the book, you say, okay, there's 1.1, and there's 2.1, 3.1. Oh, I'm on 4.1. This will be the last part. It's like, no, there's 6.1, or 5.1, 6.1. It keeps going and going. You're like, oh, okay, so what does 4, 3, 2, 1 actually mean? Because we're not going backwards. We're not going up to 4 or down to 1.
Mm-hmm.
So then there has to be some ending that makes sense of what's going on. And to get that is like, what? Like that's what you had in mind? You wanted to tell a story in some a metaphorical way to say, oh, the character in the story is really writing the story, and you're being taken along for a ride. I would have liked to have been told that at the start. Like, give it a frame. That would have been totally acceptable. Hey, by the way, this is a story I'm going to reveal to you. Here's my journey along that way. Mm-hmm. And he goes on and on. That would have been interesting to have like a fictional writer, write a story, and he takes an aside and he says, this is where I felt this, and if this happened, that would have been very interesting. Give me some bloody context as to what the hell is happening in these scenes. Yeah. Because you and I are like, yeah, I guess the guy can write well when he's talking about a certain specific thing. Mm-hmm. But when you throw it all together and expect us to have any continuity or trying to follow and remember what we read 4 weeks ago, it was like, what? Who is this again? And why? Like, is it the German part of the family? Or did the parents not get married? Is this the one where the dad died? Like, he's trying to remember who's who and where, what happened. It's such a colossal effort to write stuff down. At first I started, okay, maybe I couldn't follow the first chapter, so I'll start again and I'll write it down. And I got to the second one, I was like, wait, this doesn't really matter what I write down. He's going to keep going with whatever ideas. So yeah, there's no major theme of choice as far as I could tell. As interesting as it was for what options that Archie decided to go with, was, okay, wow, he's going to become an author. He's going to go to the movies. He loves movies because of his mom, and his mom's a great photographer. So there's all this story about him being in a car and being free, and the analogy of what happened in that timeline because of the accident of people arguing over his sex with his stepsister, or maybe it wasn't his stepsister, maybe it was actually just his family relation. Like, it was hard to follow who's who at a certain point. And this all comes down to not having a good editor, but also having the writer just learn to stop. You have to stop writing. You have to say, okay, why am I writing all this stuff? Why am I describing all these events? What is the point? So slice of life is hard enough to take in as a sort of relaxing country feeling or city feeling of a person going through the motions of living their lives. But to have 4 of them in slightly different perspectives that have no continuity, and then to be told at the end, oh, by the way, this was an idea I was having for a story, and this could have happened if I did it this way, is like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't help me as a reader, nor does it help me as a creative writer to say, okay, don't do any of this stuff what this writer just gave you, because he just wasted 2 weeks of your brain space for no reason. So
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know if I could ever recommend this.
Mm-hmm.
I think if he was writing in the creative writing class and he was doing a short story, I think this would have been fantastic as a 16-pager. And you had a little story here where this happens, and then he'll change his perspective, maybe from a different character, for one scene, and that would have been fantastic because he really knows how to take that one scene apart, whether it's about romance or what to do with your life, or it's a very mundane story. So he can illuminate those little elements and say, oh wow, look at that, and then if that's interesting, and then write a second chapter.
Yeah.
And see whether you can take it further or why you should take it further. Because at this point, all he was doing was he was going to bed, waking up, saying, oh, I want to tell exactly the same story, only slightly different if this happened, and then keep going for that.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I don't know what would make a writer do that, and what the goal was. Like if I were to write this, I'd be second guessing myself every day, going, what is this person doing? Why is he writing? Why is he, going to school? Why is he?
Yeah, it's not something you can write in a postmodernist style. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it with an extraordinarily dense, perfectly precisely planned out structure, and and then also you've got to, I mean. I think, honestly, I think this would have worked better if it had some undercurrents of like a multiverse theory or something. Like I was going into it thinking, well, maybe is he going to do like a parallel universes thing or something, which in a way he is. But if it was literally like these four versions, like in the BioShock Infinite, where there's different versions of the same narrative that are influencing one another and that kind of thing, that would have been cool. But he didn't do that. Instead, it just comes off as a literary exercise. As far as me, you said you couldn't recommend it. I understand. For me, I would not recommend this one if you were discovering Paul Auster for the first time. I would recommend you read either the New York trilogy or the Brooklyn Follies. And what I'm going to do to make that point, I have both of those books here in front of me. So the Brooklyn Follies, I'm going to read you about a page from each one of them. The Brooklyn Follies is one of his slice of life stories. And it begins this way. I was looking for a quiet place to die. Someone recommended Brooklyn, and so the next morning I traveled down there from Westchester to scope out the terrain. I hadn't been back in 56 years, and I remembered nothing. My parents had moved out of the city when I was 3, but I instinctively found myself returning to the neighborhood where we had lived, crawling home like some wounded dog to the place of my birth. A local real estate agent ushered me around to 6 or 7 brownstone flats, and by the end of the afternoon, I had rented a 2-bedroom garden apartment on First Street, just half a block away from Prospect Park. I had no idea who my neighbors were, and I didn't care. They all worked at 9-to-5 jobs, none of them had any children, and therefore the building would be relatively silent. More than anything else, that was what I craved, a silent end to my sad and ridiculous life. And that sounds dismal, but what's actually happening there, this is a character who he's an elderly man that is in remission for lung cancer, and he is just finding, he doesn't know how much time he has. The cancer is going to come back at some point, but he's hanging out. He's trying to find a place to live until that happens, to retire to. And it's the story of him reconnecting with family and making new friends and learning, finding that, he's in this place of existential nihilism where he just feels like life has no purpose and we're just going to peter out and that'll be that. And he rediscovers a passion for living, that the reason you live is to have these relationships with other people, and he meets these wonderful people and it develops his life. And he's alive and happy again, and that works. That makes sense. It's a theme. It's an idea. He sticks to it. He stays with it, and we feel like it's something that's developing on a good foundation. Now, here for the existentialist, surrealist stuff, this is a little bit of City of Glass. It was the wrong number that started it, the telephone ringing 3 times in the dead of night, and the voice on the other end asking for someone he was not. Much later, when he was able to think about the things that had happened to him, he would conclude that nothing was real except chance. But that was much later. In the beginning, there was simply the event and its consequences. Whether it might have turned out differently or whether it was all predetermined with the first word that came from the stranger's mouth is not the question. The question is the story itself, and whether or not it means something is not for the story to tell. As for Quinn, there is little need to detain us. Who he was, where he came from, and what he did are of no great importance. We know, for example, that he was 35 years old. We know that he had once been married, had once been a father, and that both his wife and his son were now dead. We also know that he wrote books. To be precise, we know that he wrote mystery novels. These works were written under the name of William Wilson, and he produced them at a rate of about one a year, which brought in enough money for him to live modestly in a small New York apartment. And the beginning, you know, the City of Glass is about a man, a writer again, who randomly receives a wrong phone call, and it leads him down this kind of spiraling blue velvet path into the blue velvet style path into this, this underworld and everything. You can hear in the narratives in both of those stories that this is a writer who now is writing with clarity and purpose and focus, and he knows what you can tell in those paragraphs that he knows what he's doing with these characters, and he knows where he's going with them. I just don't think we get that feeling when it comes to Archibald Ferguson.
I wish I could say more. It's experimental, and it's not something that I felt should have even been published, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. It has some interesting moments. If it had been done better, it could have been a triumph. But as it stands, it just feels like put it this way: it starts out promising sex and turns into masturbation. So some nice points along the way, but it could have been a lot better. Anyway, so I think that pretty much wraps it up. And again, I feel bad because Paul Auster actually is an author that I really, really love. Like I can't tell you how elated I was to see this book on the shelves. Like I said, I would start with the New York trilogy. I would read the New York trilogy. I would read Brooklyn Follies. And go from there. I would leave this one alone unless you are an extreme fan like me and can give him a lot of the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, thank you for joining us for this installment of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. We will be back next month, or possibly this month if we have time. We've been playing catch up. But we will be back next time with Scythe by Neil Shusterman. And that one, I'm in the process of reading it now, and I can tell you already we're going to have a lot to discuss with that. So I'm very excited about that one. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this, please consider making a donation to patreon.com/JordanOwen42. For Stefan Diorio, I am Jordan Owen, and thank you for checking out Book Talk, and we will see you next time. All right.